In this panel discussion, we will be talking about what's next, optimizing the energy mix to solve for intermittency, and hopefully we'll hear some solutions and some forward-looking sort of future of energy in Asia conversations as well. Before we jump into the discussion, let me just quickly introduce the panelists over here. Just beside me is Arjun Van den Broek, who's the Executive Vice President and Advisor of Chief Operating Officer at GPSC. Following him is Olivier Duguet, who's the Chief Executive and co-founder at the Blue Circle. Beside him is Raghuram Natarajan, who's the Chief Executive at Blue Leaf Energy. And following him is Johnny Wong, who's the Vice President for Hydro at Sarawak Energy. So we have a really good representation of different types of energy and different backgrounds here. So really excited sort of to hear all of your conversations. Um, with maybe I'll start with you, Arjun, and I know we're going to talk about the intermittency issue itself, which is what the discussion's focused on. But we are in a region where we have very diverse countries, and the energy mix for every country varies widely. What are the key factors that impact that energy mix to even start with?
Yeah, I think if you look at the studies, there's a lot of studies being done. You can find on the internet some studies on net zero studies, net zero Australia, net zero Kazakhstan. When you look at these studies, it depends highly on your market and your resources. So some countries have more solar, some countries have more wind, and then there's also interconnection with the other sectors. So for example, if you have a country that needs more cold, you can have waste energy or waste heat that you need, that you can integrate as well. So I think mainly it depends a lot on your availability of your renewable resources, and that there are actually mainly three. That is biomass, that is solar, and that is wind, and and of course hydro, and that's and availability of these resources in your country.
Thank you for that. Olivier, quickly follow up from that as well, but also if we specifically talk about wind power, the share has been increasing, and what's been impacting that?
Yeah, the difference between wind and maybe the other renewable energy is that the distribution is not that even between the countries. So some are basically the closer you go to the equator, the less wind resource you have. So the more north you go, the better wind resource you have. And of course also the more outside on the Pacific Ocean you go, the more wind also resource you go. So definitely that makes an interesting mix. I would say also that for the wind resource potential, the technology have been evolving a lot. I think we're going to talk about it, of course, also mainly also in solar, mainly on price and maybe a capacity factor, but in wind also, you still see three blades on top of a tower, but in fact now, and coming from mainly the low wind region of China, we can talk about making economically viable projects at 5.5 meters per second, which I don't know if some of you knows what it means, but for the moment, at 6 meters per second, there is no potential economically viable project. So we are going down and down with in meters per second because of the rotor, the increasing size of the rotor, and the increasing efficiency of the turbines. So it's the market, in fact, for wind is getting larger and larger.
Thank you for that. Raghuram, if I can bring you in here. Solar has been breaking records in the past, and we are sitting in a region where there's a lot of sun, so your outlook on that. But also, if you can talk a little bit about the issue of intermittency with solar and wind as well. Why is that such a big problem?
Sure, maybe I'll start with a bit of an expansion on what Ayan mentioned. I think on top of the resource availability, which is certainly one of the key factors, it's also the economic viability of a lot of the renewable energy technologies. I think the region has really gone through a significant learning curve on that. We started with a bit more feed-in tariff or other subsidy-driven renewables. I think we've really moved past that, where renewables is actually the cheapest form of electricity and new generation in most parts of the world, and also in this part of the world as well. So I think that economic affordability of renewables is really a big factor that's going to be pushing that through, coupled with technological advancement. It is really a way forward. It's no-brainer that renewables will have to be the new sets of generation coming in. But policy and regulatory aspects, I mean, energy being a bit of a very closely intertwined together with economics and policy, will never be out of it. And I think that's kind of the way where a lot of efforts need to be made in terms of how we look at it, whether we're competing against land in the context of solar, permitting and regulation aspects in terms of what we would need to do has to be really looked at to make sure that we can really achieve this potential and enhancing part of it. With solar in particular, I mean, most of the jurisdictions in Southeast Asia and across Asia, very much abundant solar. The context to it is a lot more in terms of what the use cases are. It's very land intensive, where you can do dual use solar or floating solar, or you start doing it in terms of agri-PV, for example, and so on, are different applications that are really trying to take it to the next level rather than the pure vanilla plain field. In terms of intermittency that we talked about, I think most of the grid in this part of the world, I think there are a lot of experiences from, let's say, Europe and also the other parts where they've gone through this cycle. I mean, we are nowhere close to even a 30% penetration rates in most of these markets. So I think we're not yet at a stage where it's really the critical bottleneck, but much more transmission capacity and distribution capacity and investments are really the much more driving factor. And that's where battery storage, particularly in the context of solar, becomes a key factor to enable that time of day electricity prices which you can get, as well as defraying some of the grid upgradation costs and other services that it can provide, will be a key part of the solution to manage the intermittency of renewables as it becomes, plus a careful, thought-out investment on the grid upgradation that we would need to do.
Just to clarify, so you're saying that we are not at a stage, especially in this region, where intermittency is the biggest challenge, right? There are other sort of challenges, yeah.
There are challenges, pockets of challenges on that, but I think there are solutions available, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's a combination of some solar plus wind in certain cases, battery, 3 to 4 hour battery storages in various markets, so pumped hydro becomes a key part of long duration storage where that resource is being available. So I think there are solutions available, plus a combination of market mechanisms that would allow for off-takers to play in this market would be able to solve this, right?
You had a quick comment.
Yeah, just to mention, and maybe make the transition also to our friend on the left, on my left. In fact, the whole region is already facing a high intermittency with its installed base of renewable energy already, with hydro. Hydro is highly seasonal here. You have two monsoon, and we know that now, especially in this part of the year, we're getting into the end of the dry season, and that's where the most stress is put on all the regional grid because there's no more water in the dam, and it's very hot, of course, and before the other monsoon is coming. So there is a high intermittency already that all the utilities of this region have to face and have to manage. So we are just here talking about adding other intermittent source of energy, which can be combined with hydro, and I think we're going to talk about it. And there's the combination, which of course will allow more penetration and more stability of the grid.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. Johnny, over to you to give us a little bit about the role of hydro. It is the majority constitute of renewable sources as a percentage, but also its role in balancing, right, in the wind and side of solar sources of energy.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, all right. As you know, hydro is already a very mature technology, and it's also the oldest energy source in the world. And if you look at the current statistics, it's about 16% of the total generations. So for us, if we use it properly, like we have a discussion just now, it's saying that if, let's say, we have the storage there, it actually can become an enabler to all these renewable energy, which is solar and wind. In terms of Sarawak, I'm from Sarawak, so I will talk about Sarawak. Our company is called Sarawak Energy. It's a vertical integrated utility and renewable energy development companies. And we have about 6 gigawatts of power, and about 70% is actually by hydropower. So it gives us a leverage in terms of right now, where we are inviting anybody that is actually wanted to come and invest with us, about 1,200 megawatts to 1,500 megawatts of renewable energy, because the existing system, because of the solar, because of hydro that we have, it can cater for this at the moment. Yeah.
And with increasing challenges like water scarcity and droughts,
Yes.
how do you see that impacting sort of the potential of
Okay.
hydro?
For us, we always have this, what we call the predictive uh, and projections of what we can have within the water. It's about managing the water resources. And we have this software, we call it dynamic water dispatch management, where it's actually give you like about 3 months of projections. So, and as well, when you do the design of the hydro, if it's a large hydro, you can have up to, like for example, we have one Bakun, which is 2,520 megawatts. It actually have a storage that can last without any water coming in for the next 6 months. So you can design it to actually be like that, and that storage can be used also to help with the solar, the intermittency issues as well.
Thank you for providing that. Arjun, if I can ask you about grid, what needs to happen in the grid itself, and I want to come to you next and talk about storage because I know that's a big part of the solution. But when we talk about the grid itself, right, what needs to happen to the grid in terms of expansion and infrastructure to be able to increase the uptake of renewables like we've been talking about here in the grid itself?
Yeah, first to start, so we are in GPSC, we have our own grid, microgrid you could call it, in Maghnaput area, where we supply the power to our customers, power and steam. So what has to happen in the grid? There's 2 grids, you could say, the one from EGAT and the one from us. If I take a look at our grid itself, my biggest concern is currently the demand of my customer. If you look at the scope 1 and the scope 2 emissions from the customer, the scope 1 normally in the petrochemical industry, you could say is 4 times, 5 times higher than their scope 2. So if we all go net zero and my customer is going to say, I'm going to electrify, that means their demand is going up with 400%. And then you come to the same issue. It's a capacity issue. So the first thing is to know the capacity, what's going to happen. Then the other thing, if I look back from my experience from the Netherlands, where you need frequency support. So you have this big rotating machines currently. That's a lot of mass that is turning around. If something in the grids happens, you don't see it almost because this mass keep turning. If you go to solar, especially solar, that will disappear. So you need a new kind of rotating equipment with a big mass that is turning around. I do believe in Thailand there's an opportunity. The PPAs from SPP are expiring at this moment. So all these units are decommissioned. We as well, we sell them, we scrap them. But actually what we did in the Netherlands is you picked an old unit that is very inefficient. Nobody wants to use them anymore. But you keep them as a cold reserve or as a spare. If something happens in the grid, you can turn them to or a rotating equipment or as a fast startup. So there's a few things that has to happen apart from technical details like protection systems that you have to change. But I think the big issue is the estimation of the demand of your capacity, because you have to know how much capacity your grid has to support.
Thank you. Thank you. Really interesting example on using those reserves as well there. Olivier, if I can ask you about storage, because again, that's already playing a big role in in how we are using renewables. So where are we when it comes to energy storage, and can you talk about some of the solutions around that?
Yes, storage for me, again, I'm a wind guy here, so storage is a different story for wind than for others. I would say solar needs storage. We don't need storage. Solar needs storage because we know that, of course, the production every day will be at peak at midday and will die at the end of the afternoon, of course, and start in the morning. That's very predictable. We know all this, and each time there is a new unit of solar installed, we know that it's going to produce all at the same time. So then, at one stage of penetration, there is the famous duck curve that you have heard, all of us have you heard about, in all the countries, so starting in California, now in Australia, where there is a very high penetration of solar, especially on rooftop. There is, at the middle of the day, when the market is open, negative prices, and that's also the case in south of Europe because there is too much production, basically. So in that case, of course, you need the only solution is battery and storage. I would say on the wind side is different because I'm not producing particularly at the middle of the day. Here in the region, the winds are, of course, linked to the two monsoons, but mainly are higher in the end of the afternoon, and the beginning of the evening. So I would say the 8 o'clock peak or 7 or 8 evening peak, we could cover it pretty well with wind. So it's longer duration, of course. So again, it's different, and it has two big production period of the two monsoons. So I would say, and again, I think it will be the same also for hydro. It's of course much more suited to be combined with hydro in reservoir, with pumping storage in hydro, because that's the long duration, of course, also way to store energy.
So that's really interesting. So from the perspective of a developer of wind energy, right, what needs to happen to increase sort of the share of wind, if I can ask that, either it's from policy perspective or investment perspective, what really sort of needs to happen?
Yeah, it's a long story, but what needs to be done? We are just at the beginning. Again, we need to also recognize that at least in wind, maybe in other technology, hydro, of course, have been also already very well developed, and all the maybe not a lot of resource is left. But in wind, we are just at the beginning. Again, in this country, for example, there have been less than 1 gigawatt installed. In a lot of countries, it's just the beginning, because as also hydro is concerned, it takes a lot of years for solar. Sorry, I don't know. Again, my solar colleagues, but I think they will say that it's pretty easy to install, and again, it takes 2 years to develop. For wind, it takes 4-5 years to develop, and at least 2 years, if not 3 years, to build. So it's also long duration, long cycles. So we are just at the beginning right now, just the beginning. I've been here for 12 years now, so I can say we are still at the beginning because we are still starting to install turbines everywhere, but the penetration is for the moment still very, very, very low. So again, we have a lot of leeway in front of us in terms of wind power, where it is available, of course, and where we can implement it in the region. So we are just at the beginning. So we are very far from being to touching the limit of wind penetration in the region.
Thank you, really interesting. Raghuram, if I can ask you about storage as a solution. We talked a little bit about that with Olivier, but if you can talk about that, particularly large-scale storage, because that's really, again, a challenge. So if you can talk about what are some of the solutions that you're seeing in that area?
I'll probably start with the grid topic first. I think it's going to be a combination of solutions. There is no one silver bullet to be able to manage this. I think first of all, there is no transition without transmission. So these are the wires that are going to carrying the electrons. So it's about efficient usage of these transmission. Olivier touched a little bit about the timeline and duration. Generally, building the transmission lines is probably the longest part of the equation in terms of how long it takes. Wind, 3 to 5 years in terms of the whole cycle. Solar, probably 12 to 18 months in terms of being able to go through that. So there's a fundamental mismatch between planning of how quickly the grid needs to be upgraded as against where the renewable generation can come online. It worked for the conventional thermal plants, which took much longer. I think renewables, that's the beauty, but also the things that needs to be planned really well to address that problem. Storage does help in the intermediate, because there are aspects of storage which could help in delaying some of these transmission, and they provide some grid support and grid stability services, which would be a key part. And we're talking about storage going through the same level of price decline as solar went through, and I think it's really at a point where it's starting to make economic sense. Solar plus storage is actually cheaper than gas in a pure technology neutral auctions in a lot of parts in the world as well. So I think that's really a big game changer in terms of adding that new. The third piece is really market elements that needs to come together, whether that's creating that PPA, corporate PPA procurement, virtual PPA procurement, as well as being able to do some demand-side responses and forecasting and scheduling becoming better. And actually, the beauty of wind and solar in this part of the world, at least, is it's actually very complementary in terms of profiles. Solar really comes down during the day. Wind comes down during the evenings. The monsoonal effect is also quite complementary. So actually, just combining wind and solar wherever it's possible could actually allow you to reduce the storage requirement much smaller. So kind of round-the-clock tenders that's happening in India is a great example of that, where a combination of wind, solar, plus storage, or in most cases, just solar and storage, are able to meet the requirements of getting up to 60-70% capacity factors that would be needed. And that's purely driven by the cost of storage being really coming down, and market mechanisms that really allows for this to happen.
Can you talk a little bit more about these market mechanisms, right? Like you were giving the example of India earlier, where this is happening. Quite positive to hear that. But what kind of, again, market mechanisms are needed, sort of, to make this happen if this was to be done in some other country?
So I think different countries have gone about it slightly differently. In the context of Australia, it's much more left to the developers to try and build that storage capacity, either standalone storage or storage integrated together with renewables, becoming a norm to try and address this. And I think they create market mechanisms like frequency response regulation, FCAS markets, and other ones where people can really make an economic sense that adds to the revenue stack for storage. Whereas other markets, some of them in Southeast Asia as well as in Japan, have gone about with centralized grid storage, where the utility is really adding all of those capacities to enable then the developers to be focused much more on just adding additional renewable capacities. So there's various mechanisms. There are examples to do so. And I think India is actually a hybrid of both, where there are some big, large central state-owned utilities doing those large BESS projects, plus developers having been forced no longer, pure solar, pure wind is no longer possible in those markets. You will always have to plan it with an element of storage integrated together with any of those designs and mechanisms that you'll have to go for.
And this is happening at a large scale, right?
It's happening at scale. I mean, these are large gigawatt scale tenders that you're seeing, and multiples of them in the market.
Thank you. Johnny, again, would love to hear your thoughts on energy storage and the potential for pumped hydro, which is also called as water battery, and where does that come in?
Yeah, I think the gentleman has said to build actually solar, you need 2 years, wind 4 years, transmission is a bit more. But unfortunate to say that pump storage, if you are talking about hydropower, it's going to take about 10 years to build. But of course, you have to look from the point of view, like for the storage for battery, it's going to last for 7 to 10 years. But if you build a pump storage, it's going to last you for 100 years. Yeah. So it's about how do you actually balance between all of this? Like, for example, what do you want? For pump storage, there is a lot of ways that you can do it, whether you want to do it for peaking or actually for storage, short-term, long-term. It can be done in a way. So, like for even in Sarawak, we are actually doing right now inventory studies to look at what actually we can build within Sarawak, and we are looking about almost 100 sites at the moment. So, like for example, once we actually look at it, then we will look at the functionality of it. Like for example, if we are growing in the renewable energy like solar and wind, then we can build this storage to actually compensate or actually cater for them.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. If I can bring you, Arjun, here as well, and I know Raghuram also mentioned about demand-side management, right? Because that also becomes important when we're talking about renewables. So how can that be done, managing demand? And if you could share some perspective on that, and maybe I can go to Raghuram as well after that.
I think at least in Thailand, so there's no market yet. So there's no retail demand management like in other countries. So you're talking about demand management from customer side, and that will depending by price driven. If your price goes up, then you can easier do demand management. In our case, one of the limiting factor that is related to the storage is the heat. So we have a heat and we have a heat network and a power network, and they're combined. So in the old days you optimize your fossil fuel, you burn fossil fuel, you generate steam and you generate power. The steam you sell to your customer and your power as well. That means if I start to get a lot of renewable power in the future, when the grid opens up, I get more renewable power in. At a certain moment, I reach my limit because my customer wants steam. So what I'm talking with the customers is, what are you doing with the steam? So actually, I can build a steam storage, so a heat storage. So that will be the next big thing coming up. Not the power storage. I think the power, we have so much capacity in gas turbines, we manage that. The issue will be the steam, because steam is difficult, you have to heat it up. So then you start to talk with the customers about, can you do demand management? Can you reduce your demand at the moment that it's not needed? Or can you switch from steam to power or from power to steam? A lot of customers have steam turbines in their plant. Can you motorize them so I can switch between power and steam? And at that moment, the demand management is not only reducing demand if the price is high, it's also a balancing act between power and steam that we can play around with. So it's probably a little bit complex, but I think there's a future there. There's a big opportunity to take a look at. So I really believe that apart from power storage, the heat storage will, for us, become very important.
Really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Raghram, if I can ask more from consumer demand perspective as well, how, again, are we seeing some more of demand management here in the region as well?
I mean, it's varied depending upon really what the final end use are. There are things like in manufacturing and data centers, where it's almost like a 24/7 supply. There, it's really about matching the right source of energy for the right source of activities that they are involved in. The others are just purely market mechanisms like time of day pricing and different things that you can do. But I agree with you, heat is an important part of it, and there are also existing thermal and gas networks that are there in various forms. Rather than having to reinvest and redo a lot of things, can we use some of these existing thermal plants as a thermal storage mechanism, where you can blend together with renewables to play that part of it, is an important mechanism to look at as well, as against new battery storage investments wherever that's required.
Thank you.
Maybe to come back on the customer, on the retail side, I read an article in the Netherlands that they make a wash machine that generates money. In Europe, there's prices that are negative, so somebody came up with the idea, I make a wash machine that is intelligent, that waits until the price is negative. You put your wash in, you make it ready, and the moment the price is negative, it starts washing.
Yeah.
Consuming energy, so you have a wash machine that is an ATM. So a wash machine that generates money. If you talk about demand management, that I hope that will ever be a future that we can see here, but you will need market price for that.
Correct.
If there's no market price, it doesn't work.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I think you mentioned the right word is market price, market. The issue, and to come back to your question on what is the biggest hurdle that we have to face as renewable energy enablers and builders, is the fact that we are for the moment facing in most of the countries the local utility which has a monopoly. Is a monopoly style of managing the grid and the interconnection. So we need access, all of us, we need access to the grid. But if it's not, there's no access, no free access and no market for our energy, free market, well, we can stop there. We cannot do anything, as we have heard from also my colleagues. So I think there is a double revolution, I think, to make in the region and in the world, happening in the world, but here also is coming with renewables, of course, and that's of course the future of energy around the world, but also liberalizing, working on the free market and opening up all the monopoly of this part of the world, which again, I'm coming from France, so I know that Indochina have been modeled on France, unfortunately. So I know that it has been a long road also in France to get out of this monopoly. We can talk about it. I mean, it's not even maybe finished, but this is the point. This is we cannot continue with one black box saying no to everything we ask for. So and so this is, I think, the real hurdle. We are everywhere, and I think all of us, we're participating in, of course, all the the syndicate, the professional associations to talk to the government and to try to explain that you must open your markets, you must open the access to renewables, knowledge of your grid. We must have also complete knowledge. I know that you want to keep it. That's why your DNA. I want to keep my grid. I am managing my grid. That's my job. And if I open it, I will have no more job tomorrow. Maybe. So that's what I think. So yeah, but we are in 21st century now. So it's opening. It's different, and that's the way to manage a grid and a power sector tomorrow. So that's. It's the challenge. It's very challenging, of course, for all these guys, I'm sure. But we are here to explain how it works in other part of the world, and that's the new world we are entering, I think.
Thank you. Really interesting. And you talked about the opening of Australia market, right? For that's one market that's more open compared to some of the other countries here.
There are a lot of examples of liberalized electricity market, and there's always a spectrum of liberalization that are there. And also example at our own backyard here in Southeast Asia, Philippines is a great example of a liberalized market. I think every country has its own journey that it'll have to go through, but the idea that people will have to get used to, and also the grid operators will have to get used to, is there is going to be more renewables in the grid. The traditional idea of a centralized grid network and control in the way how all the thermal plants and fossil fuel power plants were operating in its existing form, it's not fit for purpose for integrating a lot of renewables into the grid. So there are some structural changes that needs to be made, and that can be defrayed and planned over a period of time. And there are some immediate solutions that are available that can be easily learned from other markets that have gone through that learning curve, and that's the market mechanisms and just opening up of liberalization of certain market mechanisms and allowing for, and throw that also on the developers to try and make sure renewable developers will have to take more ownership of making sure the electrons that are going to come into the grid are going to be as much more less intermittent as possible. It cannot be completely non-intermittent, but it can be as less intermittent as possible is a key way to kind of go about it. And that would be the only way to see that transition. It's a matter of when it happens, but it will have to happen. Right?
Thank you. Really interesting points. I will come for questions just in a minute, but maybe Johnny, I'll bring you in here to talk about countries like Singapore, which don't have their own space and land to have all these solar and wind power plants. We've had ASEAN power grid that's been talked about, envisioned about 30 years ago, and it's not a lot of progress has been made on that front. So what's the potential for regional grid that you're seeing for the region? If you could talk about that.
Okay, yeah. Actually, for my company, Sarawak Energy, we have a vision which is to become a regional powerhouse. So we have started it. We have already, right now, our grid is connected to Indonesia in Kalimantan. And we are transferring electrons, about 100 to 200 megawatts at the moment. And in the near future, in a half year, in June, we will actually connect to our neighboring state, which is Sabah. So that will be actually another opening for the future where we actually can connect to Philippines. There is already a talk on that. And we also have another neighbor country, which is Brunei, which we are already in communication. And by 2030, we will be selling to them about 30 to 50 megawatts. As also being said, for Singapore, we are also in talk with Singapore, government to government, Malaysia government, Indonesia government, and also Singapore government. We are in talk of it. And if let's say everything is in place, we will have a submarine cable from Sarawak all the way to Singapore. And that will be done potentially in 2032. So that will, in a way, that establish the Asian power grid. Yeah.
You've talked a lot about different timelines here,
Yes,
so that's definitely, very, very different timelines for all kinds of projects. That's really interesting. But yeah, we can pause here for questions. Maybe we'll take a couple of questions together because we just have a couple of minutes left here. Can we get the mic here first? If you can share your name, organization, and keep your question very short, please.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Raksit from Rystad Energy. Question for GPSC. You mentioned about coal and gas plant expiring PPA. What if the market is not here yet? What do you want to happen? What do you want from the state-owned utilities? What do you want from the government? Some sort of maybe new contract with standby fee. And if I may have a second question for Blue Circle, what's your view on Chinese versus Western turbine supplier? Are you willing to consider both options? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have two types of generation. We have generation for our customers, so we have our own grid with generation on it. So what we're currently doing is we keeping our assets reserved for the generation in our grid. So the SPP assets that are linked to our grid, I keep it just as a spare for myself, because if renewable comes in, then probably I need them. The IPP ones, they're mostly, that is the ones that are only sell to EGAT and nobody else. So that ones we just decommission and we sell. There's nothing to do at this moment, and I don't believe there will be any regulatory framework allowing it to do something else with it. So it's just a pity. It's lost, but maybe to think something about it for the next 5-6 years, if more of these assets will decommission, to think about what you're going to do with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so easy answer. I am technology agnostic. I would like to, anyway, always buy the best turbines for my best, which suited for my sites. So I don't care about where they are coming from. They need to be bankable. That's the main point. They need to be bankable. That's it.
Thank you so much. We are at time, but maybe one last question. And if you can just keep it very direct. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, Susanna from SAP. So we were talking about liberalization of markets, so Australia, Japan, and so on, right? Who's next will be my next question. And even if, let's say, the more monopolistic structures are kept, where might we see smart meters and things like that, so more responsive demand management in the future?
Thank you so much. Maybe Raghuram, you want to take that one?
It's the $1 million or $1 billion question here in the room. I think, at least in Southeast Asia, where we are located, talk about it, you're seeing some aspects of that happening. The DPPA program is a classic example. Vietnam is embarking on its own journey, albeit a lot delayed than what it was originally planned. Thailand is going through its version of the corporate PPA procurement, and Malaysia has just recently announced the CRESS program under which it's happening. So I think that's a first step towards it. I think by nature and structure of it, I think it's going to be hard for all of the Southeast Asian utilities to try to completely liberalize that market unless and until they're going to be decoupling the ownership of these utilities. But I think there's going to be partial elements of it that will make it more market-like and creating maybe subdivisions like TNB has done it in terms of Genco operating on a very clear basis rather than the grid operator is something that we will start to see. And I think that's also in the benefit of their own market and also being able to export the electricity that we talked about to the rest of Southeast Asia.
Thank you so much, Raghuram. We are at time, and thank you so much, all four of you, for joining us today. This was the last session of our day 2 of this event, and thank you for sharing some really positive examples of renewable energy being deployed across the countries in the region. Really good to hear that, really inspiring to hear that. And with that, if we can thank our panelists over here, please.